channel, Boho Pock. Boho for bohemian and Pock for pocketbook or handbag, pocket, purse. It depends on your generation. Essentially, I'm a handbag designer. And although I like to design handbags primarily, I also like to do other things, depending on my creative musings. So in today's video, I want to focus on leatherworking. I absolutely adore leatherwork. And to clarify, the term leather is used to describe any fabric that's made by animal skins. So while cowhide is the most popular animal skin that leather is used for, because it comprises about 65% of all leather produced, almost any animal skin can be made into leather. I absolutely love being able to create something out of nothing with my own hands, no machines. Now, no knock to machines at all. I have several machines and I love my machines. But I recall a few years ago when I first decided to attempt leatherworking, I was completely overwhelmed with all of the ideas and the prospects of taking on a new medium. But at that point, I had only worked with non-leather fabric. So over time, I developed and still continue to develop my collection of must-have leatherworking tools. It's definitely a journey, so do not think by any means necessary that you have to have all of these tools at one time. But regardless of what tools you decide to use and what ways you decide to work with leather, there are a couple of high-level recommendations that I would include that you would need for practically any project. The first is a sturdy table, a well-lit space, ventilation. So just know that with leather, you're probably going to be using finishing agents, dyes, glues, chemicals, essentially. And you want to make sure that whatever space you have, that there is enough ways for the air to move around. And then you also want to make sure that you have a solid stamping board or cutting board. Many of these cutting boards are made out of granite or quartz or other really durable materials, but you're definitely going to need this in order to support all of the pounding that you'll be doing to stamp your leather, to create stitching holes with your pricking mediums and other stuff. So what I want to do is just give you a list of things that I think would be really great to have. It's not an exhaustive list, but it was a really good list for me to get started. So let us get started. This list is not an exhaustive list. It's just a list that I think would be good for you to know as you get started in leather crafting. The first item from this list is an awl. This is a scratch awl, and this is this is a scratch awl, and this is a stitching awl. And I'll show you the difference here really quickly. So this is a scratch awl. This scratch awl allows you, for example, if I had a pattern and I wanted to scratch the leather in the pattern so that I would know what I needed to do in terms of cutting or in terms of stitching, a scratch awl is perfect for doing that. You'll find that a scratch awl is also has many other ways that you can use it, but primarily it's intended to scratch the leather so that you know where you want to make your stitches. The next item is a stitching awl. And this awl is going to help when you want to actually stitch your leather. And I'll do another video about stitching leather, but a stitching awl really helps to define the holes associated with your project. After you've pricked the holes in your leather, it helps to define them, keep them neat, and that way when you put the thread through those holes, it does it in a seamless way. So we have the scratch awl and the stitching awl. The next item that should be on your list is an edge guide. This is an edge guide. Okay, so what an edge guide has is this mechanism that you can wind so that you can loosen it and tighten it. And then it also has this little doohickey here so that you can determine how far you want it away from this pointed area. That's the point there, okay? And so, for example, if I wanted it this far away, I could tighten it. And then, if you can see here, what I would do is then scratch down this way, and it's going to create a line here. And this is helpful along the same lines of a stitching awl, but it helps you to really have precise lines and precise stitching areas. So I certainly recommend a edge guide. The next items are these little finger protectors. I know it doesn't look like much, but once you start to hand stitch leather, you will find that having these little finger protectors is a great idea. You may end up deciding to make some of your own or some out of other material. I just have these. They came with a set that I purchased recently, and it's really, really helpful in that your fingers don't get chafed and your fingers don't rub up against your needle and your leather often. So it really does protect your fingers for projects. The next item that we will go over is a rotary cutter. And if you're familiar with sewing already, you are familiar with a rotary cutter. So a rotary cutter just is essentially a cutter that allows you to cut in a rotating fashion, and it's really helpful when you have large pieces of leather to cut or other fabrics and materials. So I got this one, and I've probably changed the blade maybe 3 times in about a year and a half. So I think overall it's really kind of it served me well. It's ergonomic, so don't think about it in terms of just cutting, but just try to find something that feels good for your hands, because you will be using this rather frequently. Okay. The next item are needles. So the needles that I use are just basic leather needles. There are other needles that would be appropriate for leather projects that are a little bit more specific to certain leathers, but I found that these basic leather needles serve me quite well. You will need 2 in order to do the saddle stitch, which is the most common stitch for leather. So I would definitely suggest that you not just buy 1 needle. You will absolutely need 2 needles. And leather needles are not as sharp as normal sewing needles. So if you are already familiar with sewing needles, there is a difference. I think I have a sewing needle here. There is a difference between leather needles and sewing needles. So as you can see, this leather, this sewing needle here has a really, really fine point, and you could actually prick yourself and it would hurt with a sewing needle. But the leather needles are not as sharp, and they definitely don't prick to the touch. The next item would be a wood slicker. And it's really, literally what it says it is. It is a piece of wood that helps to slick down leather. So you can either put a burnishing agent on the exterior of the leather or the edges of the leather, or sometimes people put water here, and it's basically used to slick down the leather. And you may not need this right away, but I do find that in a lot of cases, the leather really does need to be laid down, and it helps to have something that would do that uniformly, and that's what a burnisher or wood slicker would do. Then our next item is a utility knife. Utility knife or X-Acto knife, whichever you prefer to call it. Essentially, this is a really small handheld knife that would allow you to get really exact and fine cuts for your projects. For example, back to this project that I'm currently working on, this wallet, I was able to use the X-Acto knife to really get the cuts exact, so that once I burnished it, it really looks refined and it looks uniform. Some X-Acto knives or utility knives come with exchangeable blades, and then others come with blades that can be sharpened. So it really just comes down to what you would prefer to use in the long run. And they're really, really sharp, so please keep these away from children, and be careful when you're using them. So the next item that I wanted to talk about, is our pricking iron. This is where it gets fun. This is where leather is fun, because you get to actually prick the holes that you want to actually sew. So for example, let's use our stitching awl to create, let's just say we want to create a line here, and this is the line we want to sew. So we will stitch here, and what we do with the pricking irons come in various sizes. This is a 6mm sized pricking iron, which means that there are 6mm between each one of these points. There are 3mm, 2mm, all the way up to, I've seen 8 as well. But primarily you will use the 3, 4, maybe some 5s. It really depends on your project. These are 3mm, so it just kind of gives you an indication of what the difference is there. But what you would do after you've determined the space that you want to prick is that you will first gauge where you want to start, and then you will use your mallet, and I am not going to use a mallet right now, but I just want you to see what you would do. You would use your mallet and you would literally bang that mallet on the pricking iron, and then you would continue to do that until you have the stitching area. This is just an example of some samples that I was working on some time ago, where I used the pricking iron to make these stitch lines, and then I actually stitched it. And so what I use this as is a sample of how large the stitches are for each pricking iron. So for example, this is a 6mm stitch. It looks like that. 4mm stitch looks like this, and I tried to get fancy there. But a 5mm stitch looks like this. So, and I recommend you doing something like this just to get a gauge for the spacing in between the stitches, and I just kind of keep this on hand. Eventually you'll know what works best for you, but this was helpful for me in the very beginning. Okay, and lastly, I think we've gotten way past 10, but lastly, I wanted to just give you an introduction to the leather that you would likely want to use ultimately for leather projects, and that would be veggie tan leather or vegetable tan leather. So this leather that I introduced with regard to the holes, this is chrome tan leather. This is not leather for tooling. It's not leather that you can burnish the edges of. It's not leather that you would want to make a wallet with. It's not sturdy enough for that. This leather is primarily for clothing, if you wanted to make a skirt or if you wanted to make a vest or something like that. It's very flimsy, and you're unable to dye this leather because it's already been dyed. It's dyed through a chromium process. I'm sure that there are some ways that you could manipulate it, but in general, it's really not. It's not meant to be the kind of leather that you would do tools or stamps on. And believe me, I've tried. It doesn't come out how you would want. This leather and this leather is the veggie tan leather. So the vegetable tan leather is the leather that you would ultimately want to work with. But I would recommend when you start out, if you've never worked with leather before, that you can start working with chrome tan leather because it's less expensive, or you can start working with faux leather. And this is the really flimsy stuff that you would get at craft stores or fabric stores, but it does allow you to get a clear understanding of making your stitch pattern, creating your stitches. Again, you're not going to be able to burnish this leather. It's not real leather, so it's not going to burnish. This is not going to do anything to it. You're not going to be able to dye it. You can do a little bit of stitching using the stitch awl with it, but it's really not worth it. But you can use your pricking iron with this leather to prick the holes in this faux leather. But ideally, you would work your way up to veggie tan leather so that your projects look more refined, and it's just something that you can be really proud of. So I hope this list has helped you, and let me know down below if there are other projects or other informational items that you'd want me to delve into for leather as we go on this journey together. Thanks so much.